So welcome to this ACM live stream workshop. It's all going to be about the electric guitar and a few tips about how to make the best out of your electric guitar. I'm Matt Russell, I'm the senior lecturer here for Technical Services, which is essentially our kind of roadie school that's run here for a few years now. But really this is quite relevant to all the musicians who play guitar, who play bass. I was a guitarist, or still am a guitarist, and one thing that I thought's really quite funny is that when you're a guitarist, no one actually tells you a whole heap of things that you need to know. And I was tuning my guitar wrong, I was setting up my guitar wrong for years and years and years, and it was only through the luck of working with a lot of great guitar techs over the years and being a guitar tech for a few years myself that I've kind of learned how to do this properly, and it's well worth just taking the time. It's really nice and simple, and this is what we're just going to go through today. Okay, so after this workshop we're going to have a live Q&A, so obviously think of some questions, any question, big or small, send it in and I'll attempt to answer it, and if not, I'll get your email and send someone who can answer the question for you. So in front of me obviously is one of the most famous iconic guitars of all time, the Fender Stratocaster. I've used this one because I should imagine that most people will have a Fender Strat in their collection. If they're going to have one guitar, it's normally the Fender Strat. This one's a little bit unusual because it's got a humbucker. Some of you more observant watchers might have noticed. But I'll just quickly go through naming all the different parts because that's important in itself. So obviously we've got tuning heads, machine heads at the top here. Then one of the most important parts of a guitar for the tone is actually this little bit here, which is the nut. Just underneath the nut is normally the access hole to the truss rod, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's obviously pretty important. Then we've got frets. All of those need to be in good condition and absolutely precise. They're embedded in the fingerboard. Fingerboards are made of different materials. This one happens to be rosewood, and then you have the neck. This one happens to be maple. Then that runs down into the body. We've got a scratch plate. The scratch plate protects the body, but it also is the access into all the electronics, which are, in this case, there's a couple of single coil pickups and a humbucker, a Seymour Duncan, and a selector switch, so you can select between the different pickups, a volume knob, a tone knob, and another tone knob. That's the usual system for a Fender Strat. That goes into the bridge. The bridge is the part where the strings actually go over a certain point, which is obviously defines the length of the string from the nut to the bridge. And then that goes into the tail. The tail is where the strings actually join the body. Now you might notice actually this tail moves. So it's not a fixed tail, it's on a whammy bar. So there are certain things about that change the tone of the guitar and change how you can set it up. You can actually set a Stratocaster so that the springs in the back hold this down, so it acts more like a hard-tailed guitar. But this one's been set up so you can bend up and down. But there's a few trade-offs for that. And of course you've got your jack socket and you've got your strap buttons, all of which are pretty important. So yeah, one of the things I'm going to try and do is change a string on this guitar. The strings are actually getting a little bit old and tired. And actually you notice when strings get tired because they start to lose their tone. They also don't stay in tune particularly well when they got tired. And they're just a little bit lifeless. They don't give back as much. So they do need changing. I personally used to change my strings before the start of every gig. And one of the problems I've got, and I'm sure like 10% of you out there will have this same problem. I touch a string and it instantly rusts. It's like an absolute nightmare. There's just a bunch of guitarists who have the exact chemical makeup that rusts strings, and I am one of those people. I actually started using gold strings for a bit, but then I noticed that all that happened was my strings were no longer rusting, but all my hardware was. So there's a warning about using gold strings. But I've got a bunch of product stuff here. There's a whole heap of things out in the market. That one's a fairly common one, Fast Fret, which kind of conditions the fretboard a little bit and keeps the frets in good condition. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, another fretboard conditioner. And what have we got here? Body gloss, so that's obviously just for cleaning the board. You do have to be careful with some of these polishing products because some woods are soft and some woods are hard. So something like maple is a hard wood, and you can use pretty much most cleaning products. Something like rosewood, however, is a pretty soft wood, and so it does require a little bit of care and attention. If in doubt, just use a little bit of hot soapy water. Hot soapy water pretty much works on anything. Obviously, avoid completely washing out your electronics with it, but hot soapy water works on most things, and just a wipe down after each play is recommended. Just takes the sweat off, doesn't leave the sweat on your strings, corroding them away. But if you've got the money, change your strings regularly. And just one point about strings, obviously the gauge of string is very, very important, what you put on your guitar. If a lot of people like very light gauges, where you've got a 9 on the top, the problem with a light gauge is that the tone suffers. So you trade off your tone for the playability. So if you're having trouble getting a good tone out of your guitar, it's best to kind of maybe try stepping up a gauge to 10s or 11s, and you'll notice that you get quite a bit more tone, but obviously your fingers have to work slightly harder. But if you change your string gauge, you've then got to alter the guitar. It's a finely balanced machine that once you change the string gauges, you then have to do a little bit of work to get that back in. One of the problems, if you go up to a higher gauge, the string tension is a whole lot more, so the neck itself starts to pull this way. So you have to compensate for that. Now, there's kind of 3 areas where you can concentrate on how you adjust. Truss rod, the whole point of the truss rod is it's a rod that runs right the way down the thin neck of the guitar. This neck wouldn't be able to take the tension that's actually on these strings without a metal part running down the middle of it. So the truss rod, if you tighten it up, it pulls the neck back. So as you increase the gauge of strings that pulls the neck this way, you adjust the truss rod to push it back. With truss rods, however, you can't tighten them up when you've got tension on the strings. That's going to actually put too much stress on the neck, and often is when it starts to twist the neck. So if a neck twists this way, it's kind of game over for the neck. There's not much you can do. Movements in this way are actually all right because you can straighten it out with the truss rod. So you need a little bit of adjustment on that truss rod. Never do more than half a turn each time you're checking it. But the other thing with the gauge of string, this distance from there to there also has to change because you've altered the physics of this particular thing. And if you notice at this bridge end, you'll see that the bridge actually slants away like that. That's a very common pattern to see, this 2 slants. And the reason why you see 2 slants is because you've got the non-wound strings followed by the wound strings, and that distance has to be controlled as a result. And you normally see that pattern like that. If you play with a heavy set of strings, actually often your 3rd string is a wound string, and then suddenly this will come in line with these ones. So then you'll have 2 and 4, which is more common with acoustic guitars. You'll spot acoustic guitars with set bridges will have a 2 sloped in and then a 4 sloped out to hold this wound string here. So we've got this distance from your nut to the bridge. Now, how do you assess where you are with that distance, what's right? Well, luckily, at the 12th fret, you can play a harmonic, and I'll demonstrate that. So you've got your open string, you've got your harmonic here, and you'll notice that it's exactly an octave above, of course, because you're halving the string. Now, what you want is your 12th fret to be exactly the same. So if you listen to the note here, and then listen to the note, they should be the same. Now, actually, for my money, if we look at the tuner, we've got an exactly on E here, but do we have exactly on here, E here? So it's slightly flat. Now, if it's slightly flat, actually, this bridge needs to move up the neck slightly, ever so slightly. And that is an adjustment here, which I won't do now because we've got a little bit of tension on the string. So you would undo the tension, reduce that so that this actually moves up the neck a little bit. I mean, if I squeeze it down, I can get it in, but, so it's ever so slightly out, so that just needs a slight adjustment. If you put a heavier gauge of string, you'll find that you'll need to move it again. So that's just one element of it. once you put heavier gauge of strings, the most common thing that people talk about is action. And action is normally measured at the 12th fret, and it's the distance between the fret and the string. And I've got an action gauge here, which you essentially stick under the string to measure the action, see how far up the little ruler or actual action gauges you are. These are really cheap. You can buy them on Amazon like for about £6 now. So that's worth getting, because if your favourite guitarist or people, there's lots of things online about what people like as an action at the 12th fret and at the 2nd fret. And one of the reasons is it's all about playability. If you're strumming very, very hard on a guitar, actually you want your action slightly higher than normal. And one of the reasons for that is the action, again, is a compromise between playability. If it's very, very slight, you don't have to put much work into getting the string down. But if it's very, very high, you're going to get an awful lot. You have to really, really squeeze the string down. If it's very, very low, as soon as you play a chord, you get a lot of what's known as fret buzz, which is that. I mean, obviously I'm forcing the fret buzz on this because the action's actually quite high on this, which means I could strum it really hard and I'm not going to get a lot of fret buzz. And the way you adjust the action is, on most bridges you've got little tiny grub screws on this in this case, and you would get an Allen key in this case to higher and lower that. That would be one way of getting the string higher or lower. Same with the nut end. The nut, actually, annoyingly, nuts, you'd have to replace the whole nut if you wanted to increase the height. You can actually decrease the height by going in with a very, very small file to decrease the height. It's not something I'd recommend if you don't know what you're doing, because it would need the nut being replaced. And the other, so there's three things. You've got your bridge height, your nut height, and also this truss rod adjustment. And between those three things, you're affecting the action. So it's a delicate sort of balance of those three things. So if you've got any more questions about, setting up a guitar with that balance between those three things, then put it now in the questions, and I'll attempt to answer it, and we'll see how in depth we can get with it. Okay, so I'm gonna attempt at changing one of these dead strings, and then I will show you how to tune up a guitar, and maybe we can have a look at some alternate tunings as well. So let's start. So I'm going to have a go at this third string. This third string's pretty much black all along here, so it definitely needs changing. Now, so one tool that you'll definitely need to do this is snips. It's really hard to change strings without snips. I'd say it's probably the only tool you need. Find yourself a nice table to do this, preferably with one of these little rubber mats that stops it slipping around, and I've built myself a little foam headrest. That headrest means that I can get to these machine heads and turn them without much hassle. You can when you're backstage or something like that, you can normally jerry rig something up to work like this. But here's your most important thing, is snips. First thing, I've got this E string, it sounds dead, so I'm going to change it. I'm going to take the tension off, and if you've got a peg winder, obviously put the peg winder on, you can do this a hell of a lot quicker, but I'm not going to use a peg winder. So I've taken the tension off now, there's no tension in it, and now I can actually use the snips to snip it. Now the reason why I don't snip it when it's got tension in is because actually that can fling up and it can do some pretty bad damage. Now, first thing to do is carefully get it out of your machine head up here. You might have to struggle a little bit depending on how the person before you has actually stuck this thing in. So this guy before me has done some kind of hooping over with the thing to make it extra hard for me. Right, so that's actually one of the reasons why I don't do it, because any kind of kink in the wire like that means that it'll eventually break. So I've actually got a problem already, so I'm going to put that there, and I'm going to get some little pliers to pull at this tiny bit of wire that's stuck in the machine head, and I've got that out. So first things first, actually, and I always say this, is make sure that you get rid of these nasty bits of wire. And one of the reasons is, on stage, this can be really, really dangerous. If you tread on it, you've got this horrible bit of wire that will go right through your foot. But actually, one of the really dangerous things is if it gets inside the back of your amp and actually starts shorting your amp. So be really, really careful with those bits of wire. They need to go in the bin and be disposed of properly. Don't leave it to the last minute. Now, at the back here, I'm going to feed this cable back through. And one reference that I can look at with this string is that it's got a gold, I don't know what you call those actually, spurts or something. It's got a little gold spur on the end. Often these days, the strings that you buy will have a color-coded ball ends. That's really, really handy, particularly in the dark, so you can actually see what strings you're trying to put back onto your guitar. I think that we've probably ended up with a different manufacturer because the third string on this has got a green one, so that's not particularly handy. But again, I'm going to make sure that that's nicely coiled up so that I'm not endangering and getting ready to put that in the bin. Right, on the back of any guitar set of strings, you have normally a color coded, but it tells you what colors you've got. Your first is the thinnest string, and your sixth is the biggest string here. So normally you'd have it would tell you what set of gauge and what each gauge string is on there. This has obviously come out of a box, but I think it's a set of 10s. So hopefully that'll be a reasonable replacement for the one that we've just done. So open your set of strings. And actually, by the way, there is a real difference between different manufacturers of strings. The more expensive strings like the D'Addarios and Rotor Sounds are better strings. They are better strings. They'll last a little bit longer and they will give you a slight bit more tone as well. They're made, it's actually pretty difficult to make a decent string. So we're going for the green one here. So I'm just going to untangle the green from this set. So I have a black and a green. I will deal with this black string later on and get it back coiled up. In the meantime, here is my green string. First things first is turn your guitar back over, and we're gonna, and this is a mistake that a lot of people make, is they turn it over and then they think that's the E, that they think that's their thin E string and start threading it through there. Just remember, obviously, when you turn it over, everything's swapped round. So actually, that is your third string. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I've seen people do it so many times now that I know that to be the case. I'm going to thread it through and just make sure that it actually goes right the way through and doesn't get caught on one of these things. I've seen that a lot of times where you've started to tune up and it's just about to get into tension when suddenly it goes bang and it forces its way through to the next block where it's caught on. So we've come through, make sure that you've actually come through where you're supposed to be coming through and you're going on the bridge. Now, here is something that is a really cool tip. So right at the end, I'm going to take this tuner off. Right at the end, this is where we want to come to. So I'm going to pull it pretty straight. And what I'm going to try and aim to do is have three coils round. Now, amazingly, there are some guitarists who swear that they can hear the difference in tone between the amount of times that it's gone round there. I'm not so sure, but it's not me to question it. But I'm going to go with 3. On a Fender Stratocaster, there's quite a little technique that you can use. You go from there, and you go up to the second one along, up to here, and then I'm going to snip this there. And you say, snip already? And I say, yes, I'm going to snip now. So that is a tip for the top. I would say snip before you've actually done the actual winding round. A lot of people leave that bit on, and when they're trying to wind it on, this bit's swinging round and cutting their hands like this. I cut it straight away, and I know that I'm going to get 3 coils round this thing. Well, we'll hope. I can always re-record it if I don't. But anyway, so the next bit that I do, and I'm making sure that I keep a bit of tension in here so that it doesn't slip down, is make a right-angled hole in there so that the first thing, I get a little bit of grip on there. The next thing I do is I'll attempt to do my first coil by hand, and I'm going to go underneath the little thing that's the tiny amount of string that's poking through, and I'm going to push, I kind of get my fingers into this position where I'm pushing down with this first finger like that, pushing down, and pulling up with those two behind. Now the reason why I do that is I want to keep the tension here so I'm not slipping down there, and I want to keep the tension here so that it doesn't end up getting buckled at the top here. And you'll notice that already I've got it's tightly around the machine head. And then I can start tightening it up. Now make sure you've gone the right way, so that it should be the straightest direction from the nut to this side. So make sure you're going the right side. So don't come round this side, because you'll have tension pulling it off the nut. So with a Stratocaster, you'll notice that the strings go absolutely straight to the machine heads. With guitars like this type of guitar, you'll see that they actually do go curved off to the end, to an angle, but they always come to this side of the machine head. Right, so I'm going to tighten that up. Obviously, we'd be able to do this a lot quicker with a peg winder, or even better, an electronic one where you go like that, but I quite like to do it by hand. There's no problem with that. And we're going to see if we're going to end up with 3 coils. Now, the one thing I am really cautious about is what I want to do is each of the coil to go below the one above, and so that there's no crossover between the loops that are going around the nut. And the reason why I don't like any kind of loop going over the string is that the string is actually pulling very, very hard over the top of itself, and actually eventually will cut through itself. So it's good that it just coils underneath. And if you notice the kind of sloping of the machine head is to actually push it up against the one above it anyway. So you'll see that it'll be super neat when we've got to the end of this. So always pushing down, keep the tension with those back 2 fingers as well. So that's just something to, once you've got that technique, it's nice and easy. We're almost there, and I can feel the tension coming in. Right, slot it into the nut. And have we indeed managed to get exactly 3 windings? I only have. It's exactly 3. So, and now it's just a case of getting it in tune. So we have E, B, G. So we've got to get that to G. And obviously, if you don't know, I'm sure guitarists do, when you play on the 5th fret, you've roughly got the same note. Obviously, this guitar's hideously out of tune, but for the 3rd string, annoyingly, all the others are 5th fret, except the G string, which is 4th fret to the one above. So we're going to get a G. I'm going to use the tuner to get a G. Okay, so obviously a really important piece of kit for any guitarist is a tuner. You can obviously go with a tuning fork if you've got a great ear, but these are really, really great pieces of kit. I recommend this style of tuner. The Boss one is really good, the TU3. This is a stage classic. You see it on pretty much every big stage. I really like to have this right at the front of a pedal board because it buffers your signal up. It means you can have a short cable down to your tuner, and then really long cables after that because you've got a nice robust signal after that. It helps the gain structure. But this one's really good. You've got a choice you've got a strobing tuner in it, but I just like to use just the straight tuner. So if I play the G again, I'm going to play it with a plectrum, and you'll notice what I do is actually, because it's plugged in the guitar, you don't really know what other strings are vibrating through the pickups. So I tend to mute the other strings with my fingers and just play the string that I want to tune. Otherwise, if I don't do that, then the other strings start resonating in sympathy, and the tuner is finding it harder to separate those notes. So I isolate those strings, and I've just got the G. Now the G is ever so slightly sharp at the moment, which is fine because we get to the next stage of tuning, which is pulling it in. When you first put a string on, it has a little bit of what's known as hysteresis, which means it's got a little bit of stretch left. And we're going to try and get rid of that stretch so that when you're bending and doing whammy bar stuff, it stays in tune. If you don't stretch your string in, every time you use the whammy bar, you'll be stretching the string itself. It's still got a little bit of stretch to go. So I'm going to pull it up, and what I do is I always pull up away and try and go up to the 12th fret. And the reason why I'm pulling up rather than bending it another direction is because I don't want any kind of wear and tear through the nut or on the bridge. So I'm just going to pull it up like that. I'm going to let it sit again, and I'm going to play it again, and you'll see just how far that's dropped. That's dropped down to an F now, so we've dropped a whole tone. So back up to the G, and I'm going to do the same again. And actually, I'm going to keep this going until it stops going out of tune. And you can see it's not dropping as much as it was. We're almost there. You don't want to overdo it, because then you'll have added a sort of over stretch or over hysteresis where you can never return that string back to where it should be. Almost there. There we go. So that we've now got a nice G string. It should be pretty much stretched in. I probably would go a little bit longer than that normally. Now, here's some tips for tuning per completely full stop. When I'm tuning, I always, like I said, I always block the other strings from resonating. And we can see that E string is now ever so slightly sharp. And by the way, you don't need a pro tuner like that. You can, if you've got a quiet enough place, obviously do it on your mobile phone, or these ones are actually really, really good. In fact, these ones are excellent on acoustic guitars when you're backstage. So you can, there's nothing to stop you using this type of thing. And what these ones do is pick up the vibrations through the actual wood. So they're really good on acoustic instruments as well. So as you can see, this one's reading it slightly sharp. My mobile phone is only just about picking it up. And this one's reading sharp as well. So we could just have a quick stretch chest, although this string is so old now, it won't be that. Although that has put it back in, which suggests really that maybe this guitar isn't of the super highest quality. But that one's in, that one's sharp. Now what I don't do is tune down using the tuning head, because if I do that and get it in tune that way, what's happened is it may not have given up its tension in this part of the string, or given up too much of its tension in this part of the string, and then it's okay here, but as soon as you start playing, the tension then equalizes across the whole string in good old entropy. So it's never a good idea to tune down. So I always go tune right down and then go back up very slowly to the note, and that allows the tension to evenly go through the string. And there we have it. And look at that, my G's still holding. Again. So this is still, now this is slightly sharp. I'm going to go down and tune up to it. Right, we're in. And then I'm going to do the last few. So that's flat, so we can just go slowly up to where we need to be. I've got overdone it, so I'm going to go down and back up. Overdone it, down, back up. So we've got a guitar in tune. Now, the only problem with that, as we tune the guitar, we've got a floating bridge, so the whole physics changes as you tune each one. So theoretically, it's actually impossible, almost impossible, to get a floating bridge guitar in tune, because as you tune this one, it's detuning that one. So it's near as damn it in tune. So if we play A, it's pretty much in tune. So we got it in tune, and it'll be stably in tune as well, because we've pulled those strings in. So if you've got any questions, please leave a comment with anything and we'll try and answer it. This isn't the only way of doing everything I've shown you. Isn't the only way of doing it. This is something that I've picked up from, I've really had the luck to sort of know a lot of really amazing guitar techs over the years, and some really great guitar players as well, and they've all got their own little quirky ways of doing stuff. I mean, it's the same with drums as well. You talk to drummers about how they tune their drums, they've all got a different answer. But that, for me, I think is just about the most kind of, I've taken lots of elements from lots of different people, and it's kind of the midway. It's kind of I would call it a kind of standard way of doing that kind of thing. So yeah, if you've got any questions or comments, or if you've got a tip for me, then please send it in. I'd be absolutely amazed if there's some really good advice out there, because I'm sure lots of people have got some very good ideas about this as well. I'll just quickly cover one more thing, which I guess a lot of people do a lot, and that's lots of different types of tuning. One of the most common types of tuning is, instead of your standard tuning, is to have a drop D tuning. That's a pretty popular one. A really easy, quick way to do that is a drop D tuning turns the E into the same note as that, so you can go. And then you've got that drop D tuning. So that's nice and easy. The problem with a drop D tuning is, if this is too light a gauge, it's going to be too floppy, and you're going to get a fairly messy sound and a lot of fret buzz. And again, this distance now has to be altered. So if you're using a guitar a lot for drop D tuning, then set it up for drop D tuning and make sure you get yourself a decent gauge of string. So if you are using drop D, get a heavier gauge for this string. Now, just a quick one, and just one more note about the gauge of string. The ideal situation that you want, no matter what tuning that you choose, so if you've got different types of tuning where you've got Robert Fripp's tuning, or you've got some kind of weird chromatic thing going on, it's really important that you think about the string gauges. So if you drop them, they need to be thicker. If they're going up, they need to be thinner. And the reason being is, you actually want even tension across all your strings. And so if I feel all these strings, they're giving me a roughly even tension back against my finger. That's the ideal situation. That's what you're aiming for. So thank you very much for joining me on this live stream workshop. It's been all about the guitar, how we've been setting up the guitar, how to change a string, how to adjust the setup, all the different parts of the guitar. We had a quick look at tuners, quick look at cleaning products. I hope it's been helpful. If you've got any comments, then leave them in the comment section now. If it's comments or advice for me, that would be absolutely great. And if you want to email me, I'm mrussell@acm.ac.uk, or Mr. Ussell, if you like. If you want to know more about ACM, then why not come to one of our open days, or go to our website, www.acm.ac.uk, and sign up. And I look forward to seeing you someday soon. So, I hope you enjoyed my live workshop. I'm Matt Russell here at the ACM. I'm one of the senior lecturers on a course known as Technical Services. Technical Services was born out of a need to find some technicians for the road. It's all about working in the live touring industry. On the whole, there's lots of other jobs that it's really cool for working in theatres and things like that. But the main push is to find people, the new blood, to go out there in the really exciting world of live concert productions and touring. It's the biggest growth sector of the music industry, so it's a really cool thing to be in. The wages are great, the hours are great, the employment's great, so it's a really awesome sector to be in. So you've just watched my little introduction to guitar maintenance, which is one of the very small things that we do on the course. There's lots of things like that. So a bit of guitar maintenance, things like a bit of looking at some drums and how to tune drums, and right through to live sound, a little bit on lighting, a little bit on tour management and event management, a little bit on acoustics. So there's a whole heap of things. It's a very wholesome view of the touring industry. And nowadays, that's exactly what you need. You need to have a lot of strings to your bow to be the modern professional roadie. I don't like necessarily to use the word roadie because it makes you think of beer-gutted men with their bums hanging out. But it's the modern roadie is one of those things that is very much a growth sector right at the moment. So, got any questions about that? That'd be really, really cool. So one of the questions that I've got here is a little bit about guitar string advice, what sort of types, manufacturers and gauges. So as I said in the piece, really, it's actually better to go for those more recognized brands. D'Addario, the NYXL, happens to be my favorite string. That's the one string that seems to last a long time on my guitar. It's got a much kind of nicer sound, it's bright, it stays bright for longer, it stays in tune for longer. The one thing I have noticed, if you buy like the sort of cheaper strings that you don't recognize the name of, they start going out of tune all the time, and that goes back to that thing about the hysteresis, the permanent deformity of the string. Because when I was stretching the string in, not only was it pulling the tension in all the various parts that still had a bit of tension to give, the string itself is actually stretching, and the metal stretches a bit, and then it gets to the point where it can deform no longer and doesn't spring back. It has a certain springiness to it. You've got rid of that springiness, and that's when your string is working. And actually, to get that type of metallurgy into the string is a complicated thing. So the manufacturers spend a lot of money on that kind of research and getting it right. So unfortunately, you do have to spend some money on getting some good strings, but it's worth it, particularly if you've got an important guitar session coming up, or you've got an important gig. You don't want to be doing a gig with low quality strings and then break. I mean, one of the things that I'm really push on the course is that a gig or any performance in any case, it's the lowest common denominator that is the thing that's going to ruin the show. So the kind of number one rule is something that will not stop a show. The showstopper is the most dreaded thing. And I know there's a bunch of musicians out there that be going, yeah, remember that time where we played a gig and this happened and we had to stop. And stopping in a show is just horrendous. And it's the job of the modern technician that should never happen. And you'll notice when you go and see professional gigs with proper roadies and proper techs, it doesn't happen very often. It's very, very rare for you to see a show-stopping moment, and it's more to do with something like the power going or something out of control of the touring artist. But it's very, very important you don't have show-stopping moments. So that's, as a gigging musician, that should be something, sort of the gigging musicians out there, that's something you should be always thinking of. What would stop the show? And there's classics like the drummer and his snare drum. The drummer has a snare drum. If he puts the skin through, you actually can't carry on with the show. It's too horrible to carry on with the show. So what you would do is always take a spare snare drum. That's just one thing that you can take that means that it's no longer a showstopper. And if you've got a drum tech, obviously that broken snare goes off, has a new head put on it, and now you've got your spare snare again, because things do go twice. I've seen drummers rip through a snare and then 5 minutes later rip through the new snare as well. So that's the job of the drum tech, is to make sure that there's no show-stopping moments in that. The same with the guitar tech. It can be down to the most ridiculous things like a guitar strap. A guitar strap, if it's broken, then the guitarist can no longer hold his guitar. And if they're the singer, it suddenly is a show-stopping moment. Not only is it a show-stopping moment, it's a particularly embarrassing one. So it goes down to that kind of thing. How do you stop the show-stopping moment? So that is really my advice on strings is just make sure you've got good strings and you're not running the risk of having a show-stopping moment or an embarrassing moment. You know, it's just less likely if you've got pro gear, and that goes for the whole thing. Same with your guitar lead. People often buy cheap guitar leads. That is the very worst thing you can do. The show itself is only as good as the very weakest component. And if the weakest component, if you're a live sound engineer, you know the nightmare of a rubbish XLR lead getting in the mix somewhere. It turns the whole thing into garbage. And so you've got to look out for that attention to detail all the way down to the nitty gritty. That's what this course is all about. So another question I've got here is how you would travel with guitars. Touring is precisely that. Really, touring is all about going from one place to the other. That is mostly what you're doing. So it's actually really mega important that the touring element of it is actually catered for. Now, I've looked after a lot of bands when they've first been signed, and they arrive to the tour bus and they've got all their gear in cardboard boxes. Cardboard boxes. There's a phrase called the Mexican flight case. I'm not quite sure how PC that is, but it's absolutely true. So many bands arrive with cardboard boxes with their gear in. It takes so much longer to load in and load out of a gig, then it just becomes a real problem. So get yourself some decent cases, and there's some really good cases out there at the moment. We've got normally when I first started out, it was hardware, really hard cases, ABS with metal trim. But nowadays, SKB and Pelly Case make some brilliant guitar cases. So that is something that you should really think about, is how you're actually going to carry your gear around, especially guitar amps. You don't want all your knobs knocked off your guitar amps. Drums, you don't want scratches all over them. So think about how you're going to tour your equipment. So I have a question here from Nettie Dowdell. I hope that I've pronounced that right. What would you do differently when setting up a guitar with a Floyd Rose floating bridge? I did allude to this actually in the when I was looking at it. Floyd Rose, because it's floating, you've got that problem of you can never really get it in tune because it's going either way. But really, you've got exactly the same issues as you have with any floating bridge. The main issue is to try and always look at that action element of it. So if you put on a new set of strings and suddenly it's all out of kilter, normally what would happen if you put on a heavier gauge of strings, suddenly your Floyd Rose is being brought a lot further forward, so you need to put more tension in the back. There is actually quite a few different areas where you can adjust on a Floyd Rose, but it would just be literally taking your time and going through. You know, people can start giving you measurements and saying this is what the action should be at the 12th fret. You kind of, if you've got a way of measuring it, it's about 5/64 of an inch or 1.5 millimeters of low action and a little bit higher for a higher action. But really what you should do is just spend a day experimenting with your piece of equipment and get it so it's something that you really enjoy playing. It suits your playing. So if you're a hard player, if you like to dig in and attack, have your action slightly higher. If you're a more subtle player, then have it slightly lower, so you've got that less of a movement. Try to avoid string buzz and have that compromise between tone and string buzz. So that it's just experimenting with the various alterations you can make. Just make sure you've got the right tools to make those alterations. If you've got a small Allen key that fits in the actual Allen key, make sure it's the right size, imperial and not metric, if that's what it is, because the imperial ones and the metric ones, you can round off the actual tiny grub screws, which is a bit of a nightmare. So just make sure you've got all the right gear to make those adjustments. Here's one from Matthew Hamilton. Good strong first name that. Hi Matt, is there one key piece of equipment you would recommend for guitarist bassists to have with them in relation to instrument setup when performing at a live gig? I suppose actually I think the snips is one of the things. You want to be able to snip if you've got a broken string or just before the gig and you want to change the string really quickly, then yeah, I think it would be that. The other thing is just think about what would stop the show. So what is going to stop the show? If you've only got one guitar and your string breaks, then it's a show-stopping moment. So I suppose really a spare guitar would be something that I would recommend. The one piece of equipment that I really wouldn't do without is my Boss tuner pedal. I think that there's a kind of whole heap. It's not just Boss, but Boss do the TU3 is a really excellent piece of gear. I genuinely wouldn't do without it, and I think that's a fantastic piece of gear and should be, or pedal like it should be in your pedal board, absolutely, definitely, whether you're a guitarist or a bassist. And just make sure your jack leads are up to scratch, and make sure that you keep everything clean as well. So once you've played a gig, make sure you've got a nice rag in your case just to wipe everything down. That thin film of rust that develops from the sweat that gets on, particularly in a gig. In fact, for some reason when I played gigs, I'd have blood all over my guitars because I would always play slightly harder and I'd take the skin off my fingers. So always have a rag. It's just simple stuff like that. Really, these are great instruments. Just keep it simple. Vanguard 7, which is a good name for a spacecraft as well as a person. Hi, what gauge of strings would you suggest for C standard tuning? So that's a big drop, as heavy as you can possibly get away with, basically. So you just have to put on a heavier gauge of strings. So you'd be looking at 12s, I would imagine, or maybe 11s if you've got a light touch. But again, it is worth spending the day just experimenting. I know it's a little bit expensive just to stick on a whole bunch of strings and take them off and put on another bunch of strings. But it really is down to your playing style. You know, if you're the type of person that is just about playing chords, then really you want as heavy a gauge as possible so that when you really dig in, it doesn't go out of tune. You can have quite a high action so that you get that tone. And also the heavier the gauge, the more tone you actually get through your pickups. So really go for the heaviest gauge possible. If you're dropping your tuning that much, then maybe even think about getting a baritone guitar. One of the sort of PRS baritone guitars are good for that kind of thing, the shorter scale baritone guitars, if you're gonna go for that kind of lower tunings. Because if I'm getting that right, if you're saying C standard, you're meaning dropping it down by 2 whole tones, then yeah, you're gonna have a heavy gauge of string. So we got Nettie again. I've noticed that some top guitar players are now working with Line 6 Helix on stage. Even Alex Lifeson did on the last R40 Rush tour. Is that an increasing trend? It is absolutely an increasing trend to take modelling guitar heads on tour. The one thing that I can definitely say is that a lot of the touring bands that I've dealt with over the years, most noticeably actually Muse, the story with Muse was they used to take quite a lot of Marshall heads and loads of cabs and everything on tour with them. That's unbelievably expensive to cart around. Then they moved to Kemper heads, which are very similar to the Line 6 Helix stuff. And the Kemper heads are really, I mean, they're brilliant. Actually, a lot of that stuff that's coming out at the moment is really good. And what it does is cut down on your freight cost. It was something like hundreds of thousands of pounds had been saved on freight, let alone the carbon footprint of the tour, just by taking those on tour. But the real benefit of it is you put it on stage, and if the band are all on in-ears, they all hear the same thing night in, night out. It plugs into the monitor board. The monitor board hardly has to do anything. Same with front of house. They know exactly what they're getting night in, night out. Don't have to worry about mic placement. The sound on the stage can be extremely quiet when everyone's using modelling guitar heads, which is actually a bit disconcerting when you're a guitar tech. You walk on stage and you can just about hear the drums plodding away in the background. So everyone gets issued with in-ear monitoring so that you can actually hear what the heck's going on. Otherwise, you have no idea. When it's quiet sound on stage, you get a much better sound out front because the front of house engineer isn't having to compensate for all the sound that's spilling off the stage, all the sound that's spilling into the different microphones on stage. So there's a whole heap of reasons why these modelling guitar amps are really making inroads into live touring especially. But they're making their way into studios as well. That is a piece of technology that has come on a long way since the Line 6 pods. Line 6 pods, when they first came out, everyone was going, oh, this is brilliant, but there was a latency problem. It didn't quite sound right. but the latest breed of modelling heads that use impulse response are really good. There's another brilliant Matt here, Matt Miller. I've seen some people put a graphic EQ pedal before their tuner to help them when tuning behind sub-bass cabinets. Any thoughts on how effective? Well, here's the thing about that. I guess I can understand why that works really well, particularly if the bass itself, rather than going through the strings, is actually going straight into the pickups themselves, particularly if you've got an acoustic guitar. So yes, I can clearly see that working really, really well. If you noticed in that video, what I was doing was dampening the strings with my hands. That's also super important. All the strings will be vibrating with the sound that's happening around them. So no amount of EQ pedal is going to take that vibration out, and the harmonics that are developed off those strings, even if it's a bass frequency, the harmonics off those strings will still be making their way into the tuner, and the tuner is actually trying to identify that harmonic series and shows you that harmonic series as the note that it thinks you're playing. So not necessarily is it going to cut out all the sub bass, because the tuner will still see the harmonic series of that sub bass. So you've got to make sure that you're dampening the strings. But yeah, that actually sounds like a pretty cool idea. It's quite an expensive idea, I would have thought, if you're just a new gigging guitarist, because it's like just to help your tuning efficiency. I've never actually had any real problems with tuning when the guitar's out front, but I can understand if you are backstage as a guitar tech and you're right next to the bass bins in Guitar World and you're trying to tune there, then yes, as a guitar tech I can see that being a really cool little thing to do. So thanks for that top tip. Nettie Dowdell, I'm about to fit out a studio room at home. Would you recommend the GIK acoustic panels like the diffuser behind you? Yes, absolutely. When you're building a home studio, it's really, really important that you find out where your reflection points are. Now, there's a whole heap of things. It is something that we cover on the courses. We do a whole module on acoustics and how to design a studio like this. It's quite easy actually to overdo your acoustic paneling and make your room dead. But what you want to do is just get rid of some of those early reflections, just to make your monitoring as accurate as possible. If I'm going to go with one tip for just one place where you should stick a diffuser or some form of acoustic absorber, is to use the mirror and get someone to walk along your wall with the mirror, and when you can see your speakers in the mirror, then you know that that's your first reflection point off the speakers, and you can stick a diffuser there or an absorber there, and that will take care of that first annoying early reflection that takes a lot out of the clarity of your sound. So give that a go first. It's definitely worth doing some form of treatment in your studio. And if you ever really want to look into that a lot, is just record your vocals just speaking in a studio. You don't realize how much your brain, when you're in a room like this, or at any room, when you walk into a room, your brain instantly goes, this is an echoey room, and kind of gets rid of it all psychologically, so you don't hear it. You do hear it when you go back after recording in that room and put it on your ears and start mixing it, particularly when you put a big compression on. You suddenly start hearing all this reverberant sound and all the horrible parts of the reverberant sounds, like the early reflections. So just spend a lot of time in a space recording just yourself talking, and see what those things are when you start playing them back on headphones with a little bit of compression, and you can start to see some of the faults that you might have in your listening environment. And other thing, of course, like one of the things that's very hard to control in small studios is the sub bass. So yeah, those kind of bass traps that you stick in the corner are often a really good idea as well. You also say, in my pub band, the guitarist is always very loud. Are plexiglass screens effective in a small pub to deflect the sound upwards? Absolutely. One of my friends used to actually built himself a very small acoustic shield out of Perspex, with a little bit of absorption on it as well, so that he didn't get slapped back off the Perspex onto the microphone on the guitar amp. But yeah, if the guitarist needs a certain guitar sound and he has to have his amp at a certain volume, then yeah, the only solution is to have something in front of it to stop it going straight up into your ears. Yeah, there isn't really many other solutions. The other good solution are things like the Marshall Power Brake or products like that. Radial do one, and a few other, the THX Hot Plate or something like that. They're pretty good, although as a guitarist I never quite managed to get the tone I wanted, even if I had one of those in the chain. But they are quite expensive, and I guess, yeah, the plexiglass screens are probably the most effective way of bringing down the volume, and it's really important. A small gig, I mean, it's the front of house engineer's nightmare is the fact that what they want to do is have everything coming through the PA, so as they push the faders up, they've got control of each of the instruments. Now, if they pull down the guitar fader like that and it's made no difference in the sound, the guitar is only coming off the stage. That means they've got no control of it anymore. It's not in the mix. So yeah, it's really important for everyone, and obviously everyone gets really annoyed with everyone else because everyone perceives everyone else in the band as being far too loud. So that's a really good question, and it's something that I've attempted to do, have one of those shields in front of my guitar, because I used to play with a Vox AC30. Vox AC30s are incredibly loud when you want to get just a decent sound out of them. And it's the perennial problem. Of course, the other problem is that drummers also play extremely loudly, and again, plexi screens do work well with that. It means that you can have drum kits next to violins and be miking up, and that's they work extremely well. However, I don't think they look particularly cool in a small venue when you've got your drum kit surrounded by a plexi screen. It kind of takes the authentic edge off being in an indie band, for example, and it does, it separates the musicians as well. It affects the vibe. However, if you're trying to do a good recording, it's almost absolutely essential that you've got something in the way of various sound sources and other sound sources. In a studio, obviously, you have large gobo screens that stop those sounds bleeding into all the other sources of sound. Here we go. One more question at the moment. So Matt Miller, didn't Eddie Van Halen use a rheostat to lower the mains voltage going to his amp so it broke up at lower volumes? Yeah, you can do that. Although rheostats for that type of mains voltage are incredibly heavy, and they're if you, I mean, they're massive boxes, and I haven't seen one for a while. We did have one at Sensible, and it was a huge box, and you could dial in the voltage. But the problem with a lot of the voltage changing things, mains changing voltage things, is that it starts to clip the waveform, so you often bring in loads of kind of low hum and things like that. I think that was probably a bit of an old-fashioned way of doing it, a bit like sticking a light bulb in between the guitar head and the guitar amp, and the light bulb would actually glow and take away some of the energy before it got down to the cabinet. So that's another way of doing it. The only thing about lowering the mains voltage to your guitar amp is really all you're actually doing, if you think about it, is that the transformer in between the mains voltage and the rails that power the tubes or the valves inside the guitar head, is that now really you're just dropping the bias voltage. Now, dropping the bias voltage does mean that the tubes will actually not be as hot as they should be and not in their correct operating temperature. Now, that might mean that they kind of break up earlier, but I would have thought actually normally that the harder you drive the valves, the more that you actually get the saturated sound that you want. The reason why tubes work so well is when they saturate, they have a lot of even harmonics on top of them, unlike transistors that have a lot of odd harmonics on top of the harmonic series in the distortion that they create. So yeah, it's not something I've tried, and I don't doubt that Eddie Van Halen and his tech team tried that sort of thing. I mean, Van Halen in the 80s was undoubtedly the most famous guitarist there was, and I'm sure he had some crazy guitar techs trying absolutely everything to make what he was doing better and better and better. But yeah, I wish I could remember all those interviews I read back in Guitar Player magazine back in the 90s, but I can't. So I can't say whether that's true or false. But yeah, you could give it a go if you happen to have a rheostat lying around, which I very much doubt. I'm not even sure how legal they are these days. So if you've got any more questions, keep them rolling in. I'm actually going to show you one thing on this guitar. It was something I noticed when I picked it up that just flows from the thing that I was looking at earlier on. This guitar is actually a really, really classic guitar, the Takamine. But notice this, as I play up the neck, we've got odd places where we have fret buzz. And you can see that a guitar tech has attempted to raise the saddle here so that it brings up the string so the action is higher, but it's not solved the problem. And the reason why it hasn't solved the problem is because the neck itself, and I doubt we'd be able to do that, but the neck itself, if you were able to look down the neck, you would see that instead of having a bow shape like that, it's actually bowed the wrong way. So you've actually got a hump. So if I was to exaggerate it, we'd kind of have this hump here. So the problem with that, of course, is that these frets are slightly lower than these frets here. So the moment that you play, you get hideous fret buzz. The way around that is literally to loosen the truss rod. So probably what's happened with this guitar in the past is that it's had a heavy gauge of string on it. Someone didn't like that. They decided to put a lighter gauge of string on, which means that the truss rod is pulling this headstock too far back. So now it's going too far back, and we'll never get rid of that fret buzz without adjusting the truss rod. So there probably is quite a bit of work now to get this guitar into a really playable touring state. But you know, this is something that you would now no longer be able to use live or in the studio because there's too many faults when it comes to actually fret buzz on the actual guitar itself. The actual action is still quite decent. So actually this part doesn't really need adjusting that much. So it's just a case of adjusting the truss rod and finding how we're going to get this headstock back, adjusting various other parts and seeing if we can get this back in shape. So if you've got that problem at home, that's the solution really, is to if you've got fret buzz that is happening in various different places. So the action should, you know, be sort of gradually getting higher as it goes up this fret. But if it's not, you'll be able to kind of adjust these various things to get it back in. If it's too far out, it's something that you'll probably have to take to a luthier to make sure that you're able to, you know, get that back in. Have we got any more questions? What about, we could have a look at, one of the things that we do look at here is touring setups and tech riders. If you're a gigging musician, a tech rider is a really, really important element of the way that you tour. It's really just a kind of manifest of what you're going to take on tour or what you need to actually do your gig. Now there's some common mistakes on it. The most common mistake is to not be specific enough. So you just put, oh, we need a guitar. Now, if I'm a promoter or someone who's looking after your equipment, I'm thinking, well, what guitar? It's much better to put a Fender Stratocaster or a Gibson Les Paul and say exactly what type of guitar that you actually need. And that way I can make a phone call and say, well, I can't give you a Fender Stratocaster, but I can give you a Fender Telecaster, and we can have that conversation. But I'm gonna have to phone you up anyway if you just put guitar. So it's really good to be specific, and that's something that when you're touring, you need a document that outlines exactly what you're taking on tour, exactly how you want the stage set up. So a nice stage plot, including all the really things. I know that all of you out there who play gigs will be fully aware of this one. When you turn up and you've got your pedal board and you've got your guitar amp, but you've got nowhere to plug them in, it can be the most frustrating thing when you turn up to a gig and you just don't have the main sockets to plug your equipment in. So why not draw on your stage plot exactly that mains drop, that you need to have some power at that point on the stage. That way, if you send that to the venue before you get there, they'll be there, and if they're not there, they say you're going to have to bring your own 4-way plug board to get to that side of the stage. Well, that's fine. It's much better that than having to sort of drag your guitar amp off the stage and plugging it in the wrong place. So think about all those things. What is it that you need on stage? Where do you want it on stage? And actually draw it on your stage plot and say, this is where I'm going to have my guitar amp. This is where I need my mains drop. This is where I want my microphone stand. This is where I want the wedge that I listen to my vocals in. And just have that on your stage plot. Get that stage plot as accurate as you can. That will be a brilliant thing to have in your tech rider. And always have the name of the artist, the name of your band at the top of the page, so that when you go to a festival and it's printed off and they've got hundreds of these things, they know which band it actually is. And if you've got a good stage plot, you won't believe how handy that is in terms of being able to mean that when you turn up to a festival, your act is going to have the smoothest ride out of all the other acts that haven't done that. And it's the one thing that puts you, that's just that little foot step ahead of what other people are doing. It's going to be the things that set you up to be that more professional a band. And the same with, make sure you have some good jack leads, make sure you've got nice strings, etc., etc. So I'm going to wrap it up now. So if you've got any other questions and you haven't got any, and you haven't had a chance to put it in now, just email me, mrussell@acm.ac.uk, or Mr. Ussell if you like. I'm more than happy to answer any questions on any subject to do with touring or whatever you like. If you have more curiosity about what we do at ACM, then please book yourself an open day at www.acm.ac.uk. If you come down to the open day, you'll almost certainly bump into me, and if you're lucky, you'll bump into one of my more esteemed colleagues and be able to talk to them about anything across the entire piece. One of the great things about the ACM is that this is the music industry in miniature. There's singers, there's guitarists, there's producers, there's business managers and tour managers and event managers and roadies and live sound engineers. We're all here, and it's a fantastic community. And once you come, you can be submerged in essentially the music industry. We are here to get you out and into the world. So we're also in the middle of clearing, so we're now clearing. So if you want to level up, call our admissions team and they'll guide you through the whole process of getting here and upping your game to ACM. So you can call the admissions team on 01483 500 841. That's 01483 500 841. And keep an eye on our social media, because there will be some more of these live stream workshops, and as I just said, it can be on pretty much any subject, so definitely tune into them, because there's some fantastic people doing that. Yesterday we had Shay Stedford, who's an awesome producer, and it was an awesome live stream workshop of which I learned absolutely loads. So I've been Matt Russell. Thank you very much for watching.